One of the ways I believe that Canada can really support the First Nations is to first of all demand that curriculum is placed in their school systems, not from the post-secondary school level up and not from the high school level, but starting right from the very beginning, from children that are going to be able to absorb and then keep that continual curriculum going. And they need to be able to put forward a curriculum that is vetted by the First Nations themselves. Because after all, it's our story that's being shared with them. And we need to tell our story, as well as the views of what Canada is on how, in fact, they developed as a country and how we intertwine and we have intermingled for centuries. This is not new to us, but it's new to Canadians, and it's especially new to new Canadians now that are coming into our country. And we again welcome new Canadians with open arms. They come into our territory, they come into our treaties, and they know nothing about us. So I think it's very important that they have to understand that what the Indigenous story is of that territory, and be able to understand what our history has been throughout the centuries that we have had this interface with Europeans and other cultures.
What I often say to Canadians, Indigenous, but very importantly also non-Indigenous, is that if we are serious about being the country we claim to be, and recognizing that we live in a place where only the Indigenous peoples can say this is their homeland, they didn't come here from anywhere else, that the rest of us have a place to be humble and to realize that there's much that we have not been taught or have not learned about ourselves and our history. And the fastest way to do that, I think, is to look at the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They came from the biggest canvas of recorded statements from Indigenous people ever in the history of our country, almost 7,000 people who spoke to us. And a reading of that report, and particularly the 94 calls to action, will help people know exactly where they fit into that work, what we have to do to establish respectful relationships between and among ourselves, and what we have to do working together to undo the harms of the past.
The best way to renew a relationship is to follow the promises originally made with the treaties. That would be the first step. Acknowledge those treaties that were signed with all the nations throughout the country. But recognize that in order to have a renewed relationship with a distinct nation, you have to support that nation in all areas for them to be successful themselves. And this goes to economic development, it goes to education, it goes to infrastructure. It's a quality of life so the nation can be successful. And by ensuring that the nation is successful, you're renewing a relationship.
So for me, I think support comes in many forms. First and foremost, creating space for us to do our own healing. So there's a long line of history, and you could go back into academics or people who want to help. You know, the path to hell is paved with good intentions, so to speak. You know, save the man, save the child, kill the Indian. So these people actually, historically, Canadians thought they were helping us when actually it was detrimental to our people. So I think we know the support we need internally as Indigenous peoples. And I think if you look into look to our own knowledge keepers and our own spiritual leaders, and so first and foremost, I think Canadians in Canada can make space for us to do our own work, to be partners with them. Second, I think there's lots of education that needs to happen. You know, as we come into Canada 150 and it celebrates its 150th birthday, I think it's time for reflection and self-examination on behalf of Canada and all Canadians, because this Canada 150 comes on the heels of the TRC, which explicitly names and calls out what happened with residential schools. All four of my grandparents went to residential school. My father went to in what's known as Indian Day School. So even though I'm not, a direct survivor, it affects my everyday life and my everyday existence as an Indigenous human being. And so, as we come into this birthday, this Canada's birthday, I think we examine what residential schools were. There's the inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women. So, in terms of support, I think education has to happen at all levels. And I think not only for us, for Indigenous people to have our stories heard and to have our knowledge and existence validated, but for other people too. So for Canadians, because our story is just 150 years of colonization, is fairly recent. We say we've been here since time immemorial. Scientifically, it's 13,600 years, and that's a hell of a lot of stories to be telling that could actually enrich the Canadian experience. So I think it'd be beneficial also for Canadians to learn. And maybe if they learned our stories, it'd be less, it'd be harder to hate us. It'd be harder to be discriminatory towards Indigenous peoples and easier to love because our stories are rich and vibrant. And so I think creating space, education, and I think there needs to be more recognition of Indigenous title and rights to land. And when I say this, I mean not just the simple fact of, okay, we're going to acknowledge whose territory we're on, but how are we going to act when we go into other people's territory? How are we going to conduct ourselves when there's people who have ties directly to this land here in Ottawa, Algonquin territory? When you come into the Central Coast, people call it the Great Bear Rainforest, or most recently the Queen's Canopy. But it's not. It's territory that's rich and vibrant in stories. So I think there's a lot of different things Canada and Canadians need to do to support a renewed relationship.
Well, what I'm concerned about is that the average Canadian has the opportunity to stay in touch with the dialogue that's taking place. I think in the past we've seen these dialogues take place behind closed doors. I was personally associated with the Charlottetown Accord. I believed in the Indigenous portion of that it was quite important. But by the time we got the agreement, we didn't have time to get out there and explain to Canadians what it was all about. And I don't think you can do that in the short term. You have to keep people involved. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has done a great job of the way they released their report, with the preliminary report and the recommendations out early. They got the dialogue flowing. We need to keep that dialogue going with Canadians.